Melbourne has a lot of trams. We have the largest tram network of any city in the world, a fact that tram enthusiasts here love to annoyingly repeat constantly. Now that I've been cancelled, this is a scrubber tram. Very charming, but do you know what it was used for? Even if you did, in this video I'll be going over everything there is to know about the scrubber. What and why? What is a scrubber tram? Well, these trams scrub the rails clean of any debris and grime that might accumulate, hence the name scrubbers. This was done through grinding blocks on the top of each rail. The blocks could be raised and lowered when needed and were made of carborundum, a type of very porous silica carbide stone. The porosity of the stone was important, as the friction of scrubbing would generate a lot of heat. A cooling system was added, where small external tanks carrying water were installed, and with the help of gravity, water dripped down and seeped into the stones, cooling them down. The blocks could also be lowered fully when the tram was making an emergency stop, given their high friction. While going over points, they were to be raised up, as the points would chip and fracture the blocks if contact was made. Another job of the blocks was also to grind the rails themselves and maintain the rail profiling. So rail grinders, but for trams. Although the M&MTB did have dedicated rail grinders, even stealing one from Sydney. Tram rails aren't like train rails, as they also have these grooves called flangeways, an area not easily cleaned by the flat blocks. To fix this issue, water jets were added, which would use high pressure water to clean out the flangeways. The water jets drew water from this much larger and much more noticeable tank, as it engulfs where the passenger accommodation would have been. This makes a very odd looking tram, especially the retrofitted ones. Points and crossings were also not to be watered, which is strange, and I'm not entirely sure why. You can always tell where a scrubber tram has gone over, as it would usually leave a splatter of water around the rails where it had cleaned. Other system scrubbers even had a vacuum to suck up the debris. And we did have a tram like this, number 6. It's not a scrubber though, as it was only a suction tram. Scrubber trams. Melbourne had a number of scrubber trams, 7 to be exact. 11W, 10W, 9W, 8W, 5, 4, and 3. The numbering system is a breakaway from the usual, with the letter preceding the number rather than the other way around, although it was only changed in 1975 when the Z classes were introduced, and previously these trams would have ran with just a number. 5, 4, and 3 were withdrawn and scrapped before they could be renumbered. The trams not being in numerical order can also be explained as there was other W rolling stock. The label W was just a label for all of the M&MTB's work stock, like this monstrosity, 7W. The Frankenstein on screen was built for flushing and scraping out rail grooves, as the original scrubbers were more primitive. In the 1950s it was modified to genocide weeds instead, and in 1964 it was rebuilt with W2 cabs, but you can still see part of the old cab. Given what scrubbers carry, tons and tons of water, they were extraordinarily heavy, essentially moving bricks on wheels, especially for their size. You definitely wouldn't want to get in front of a scrubber while in operation, although if they were actively scrubbing, they wouldn't be going very fast. These trams were most active in autumn, when dried up leaves would get all over the tracks and reduce traction. The best part about using a tram like this is that it could be deployed anywhere around the network in a short amount of time. Now for actual scrubbers. I won't go through each and every one as there were quite a lot, but the most interesting ones will make it in. 8W. This is what you think of when I say scrubber, mainly because it's the most famous one. Technically, in this works list from the 1960s, it's not labeled as a scrubber, rather, it's a track cleaner. This is inaccurate as it possesses all the traits of a scrubber, while the other track cleaners were just some lousy track cleaners and didn't use carborundum blocks to scrub. 8W was built in 1934, being first numbered 8 at Preston Workshops. It was built using parts from a C-Class tram, number 32, who donated its cabs, and another scrubber, number 3, donating other parts. It did its job as scrubber after being set free from the workshops. The Footscray network didn't have a scrubber. Given that the M&MTB had numerous other scrubbers, they allowed it to scrub there when needed. In 1961, its body was reinforced and repainted in the diagonal black with white stripes. It was then renumbered to W8 in 1975 and was also repainted in Met colors sometime after the Met took over in the 1980s. By the 1990s, it was getting pretty old. So 8W was put in storage for a few years at Malvern Depot, and in 1999, it was donated to Ballarat, At the same time, 9W was donated to Bendigo. It was towed by W7 1008 to Preston Workshops on the 26th of November, and both trams shared the same track outside the paint shop for a few days. The tram was loaded onto a low loader and arrived at Ballarat on the 10th of September, with the PTC very generously paying for transport costs. However, to unload it, a section of overhead at the old loop on Wendouree Parade had to be removed to unload the tram, due to the ground at the depot being rather soft. An issue occurred when unloading, as the axles and wheels fell off the tram, due to them not being attached to the frame. This wasn't an issue at Preston, as the tram was loaded using a loading dock, but at Ballarat, a crane was used instead. After chaining up the wheels, the tram officially touched Ballarat metals for the first time. When the overhead was repositioned, it was towed by 661 to the depot. Many parts of the tram were missing due to it sitting in storage for a few years, and a few things needed work. After 3 years in 2001, it was miraculously back in service and back to scrubbing railheads. In 2005, it was repainted in its first livery, green and cream. Let's take a moment to watch this clip of it rolling along. Now that's beautiful. Mr. Max Production 16 has also given me a behind the scenes image of this very inaccurate and quite frankly laughably bad rendition of 8W. It was also built in like an hour for a competition because Max is that good. Sydney Scrubbers. This refers to 11W and 10W, which were formerly Sydney trams, K-class tram cars to be specific. They were built in 1908 by Meadowbank Manufacturing and entered service as normal passenger trams. 11W originally 767 and 10W originally 763. They trundled around Sydney for nearly 50 years, carrying passengers. 11W was converted to a scrubber for Sydney's network in July 1953 and allocated the service number 139. W10 was converted the previous year in 1952. They were both sold to Melbourne in 1959 after becoming surplus due to the shrinking Sydney network, still one of, if not the biggest transport loss to the city. They re-entered service in 1960, this time in Melbourne, with service numbers of 11 and 10, which were changed to 11W and 10W in 1975. Given they are Sydney trams, they must have looked really out of place, especially when they were repainted bright school bus yellow. 11W was modified slightly from its original condition. A pantograph for observing the position of overhead was added, which is absent from 10W. When privatization hit Melbourne's tram network in the late 1990s, the trams were separated, with 10W going to M-Tram and 11W going to Yarra trams. They were both withdrawn in 2002, being the last scrubbers in service, and were placed into storage at Camberwell Depot. The Sydney Tramway Museum very quickly snapped up 11W in December 2003. It sat in storage for an impressive 12 years, when it finally arrived in Loftus in February 2015. In that time, it also moved from Camberwell to Preston Depot. And here it is in 2010, peeking out from behind Preston Workshops. 10W went to Bylands and was shortly transferred over. Both seem to be doing well, with 11W being repainted into Sydney colours and it's currently fully operational again. However, 10W is yet to be seen. Modern day equivalent. So why aren't scrubbers used anymore? Because we now have cars, which is the answer to why most transport related history isn't around anymore. The scrubbers were already starting to get a bit old in the 1970s, yet were still used. In 1998, this letter was written to Ian Dobbs, CEO of the PTC, from a member of the Met Trams. It details the need to replace the trams. Only one scrubber remained in service at the time of this memo, 10W. 11W was sitting at Preston, awaiting new tyres, and 9W was experiencing a case of extreme body deterioration, and would be cannibalized to keep the other two in service. Now by the 1990s, these trams would have been a bit of a pain to keep in service, and the memo said as much. Spare parts were hard to come by, and the expertise needed to maintain them would have been long gone, or in a completely different city. Free drivers were also hired to specifically operate the scrubbers, 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. Not good for profits either. So what was the replacement? A truck. To be more specific, a tram track cleaning truck. There are a few of these in service today, but going through them is a whole nother video. These trucks use brushes instead of carborundum blocks, as carborundum is more expensive and more fiddly than a few brush heads. These scrubbing vehicles patrol the network every few months, or when required, especially in the leafy season. You're probably wondering what happened to the last 3 scrubbers. Well, since they are so different and odd, all 3 have been preserved. You already know about 10W and 11W. However, 9W ended up at Bendigo, being used as their track maintenance vehicle, today painted in this much more striking livery. Other places. Of course, other places had scrubber trams. Most networks around Australia did. However, I would like to specifically mention a few interesting scrubbers. A specific scrubber from Sydney, 134, has had a very interesting life in preservation. After being preserved and restored, it was actually used on a number of new projects. It was used on the newly built Eastern Suburbs rail line in 1979, where a small diesel motor generator was used to power the thing, given that it couldn't use the overhead, which is a funny thing for us in Melbourne to see, as we never really had any cases where a tram could actually travel on the rail network, except for one. It was used again when the first section of the Sydney Light Rail opened up to Wentworth Park in 1997, and for it to run there, a pantograph was installed and an extra resistor grid was added so it wouldn't blow up, as it was built for the 600 DC of the old system and not 750 of the light rail. 134, like 11W, also resides at the Sydney Tramway Museum. In Victoria, other systems also had scrubbers. Bendigo and Ballarat famously had very similar looking scrubbers, and their networks will definitely be the subject of another video. Even the Victorian Railways tramway had one, which I definitely didn't forget about when I was making a video on those lines. Oops. Hello all, I hope you liked the video. Scrubbers were definitely an integral part of the M&MTB's work crew. If you would like a place to hang out, consider joining Discord, and if you want to support me further, consider joining the Patreon, links in the description. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all later.